Hollywood has always sold a dream, a land where talent conquers all, where hard work leads to fame, where the biggest stories are told on screen, but behind the glitter, behind the flashing cameras, behind the smiling stars, another story was unfolding. A story of men who never appeared on magazine covers, men who never walked red carpets, men who didn't seek fame, because they already had something better, power. And among the most powerful of them all was a quiet, calculating immigrant from New York, Meyer Lansky. While Italian mobsters like Al Capone became household names, Lansky stayed invisible. No flashy suits, no violent outbursts, no loud speeches, just numbers, networks, influence, and eventually, Hollywood. But to understand how a Jewish gangster came to control parts of America's most glamorous industry, we must start in the darkest corners of early 20th century New York. At the turn of the century, thousands of Jewish families fled poverty and persecution in Eastern Europe. They arrived in America with nothing, crowded into tenements, working brutal factory jobs, facing discrimination from nearly every direction. The Lower East Side of Manhattan became a pressure cooker of desperation. Crime wasn't a choice, it was survival. Young Meyer Suchaljansky arrived from Belarus in 1911. He was barely 10 years old, small, quiet, intelligent. Other boys learned how to fight. Meyer learned how to calculate. He saw patterns. He understood probabilities. He could memorize numbers instantly. While others dreamed of being strong, Meyer dreamed of being untouchable. By his teens, he met another young street hustler, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy was everything Meyer was not: explosive, charismatic, violent. Together they formed a perfect combination: brains and brutality. They ran protection rackets, robbed rival gangs, hijacked shipments. But unlike most street criminals, Meyer wasn't satisfied with small-time scores. He studied organized crime like a business. He noticed something important: Italian gangs fought each other endlessly. Irish gangs did the same. Everyone wasted energy on ethnic rivalries. Meyer believed something radical. Crime didn't need borders. Money had no nationality. This belief would change American organized crime forever. In the 1920s, prohibition exploded across America. Alcohol became illegal. Demand skyrocketed. So did profits. Meyer Lansky partnered with Italian rising star Lucky Luciano. Together, they created a new criminal model. No more chaotic street wars. Instead, corporations, hierarchies, profit-sharing agreements. Meyer handled finances. Luciano handled muscle. Bugsy handled enforcement. They built bootlegging routes stretching from Canada to Florida. Millions of dollars flowed in. But Meyer didn't waste money on luxury. He reinvested. Casinos, gambling dens, bookmaking networks, labor unions, shipping companies, every dollar was washed, cleaned, multiplied. By the early 1930s, Meyer Lansky wasn't just a gangster. He was a financial architect of the American underworld. But one industry still remained largely untouched. An industry with massive cash flow, influence over public opinion, and endless opportunities for laundering money. The motion picture business, Hollywood. At the time, Hollywood was still finding its identity. Many studio founders were Jewish immigrants themselves, men like Louis B. Mayer MGM, Harry Warner Warner Bros., Adolf Zukor Paramount. They were businessmen, not criminals, but they faced heavy anti-Semitism. They wanted respectability. They wanted legitimacy. They wanted distance from crime, which created a strange situation. Jewish studio heads on the surface, Jewish gangsters underneath. Two worlds that rarely acknowledged each other, but quietly intersected. Hollywood produced enormous amounts of cash. Most transactions were done in physical money. Perfect for laundering, perfect for skimming, perfect for organized crime. Meyer Lansky saw Hollywood not as an art form, but as a financial engine, and he wanted in. The first entry point came through gambling. Actors loved gambling, directors loved gambling, producers loved gambling. Private poker games became famous in Beverly Hills mansions. Many of those games were quietly financed by Lansky-backed operations. Soon, stars owed money. Debts created leverage. Leverage created control. Next came unions. Hollywood labor unions controlled crews, transportation, and set construction. Mayer already controlled unions in New York. He simply expanded west. If a studio had labor problems, Mayer's people could make them disappear. If a studio resisted, strikes suddenly appeared, equipment vanished, projects stalled. Most studio executives learned quickly. Cooperation was cheaper than resistance, but Mayer's biggest move was still ahead. He sent his old partner west, Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy didn't just go to Hollywood. He fell in love with it, the parties, the actresses, the mansions. But he also saw something else. The desert, Nevada, Las Vegas, a dusty railroad town with legal gambling. Bugsy believed he could build something revolutionary, a luxury gambling resort, not a dingy casino, not a backroom operation, a glamorous destination. Mayer funded the vision. Hollywood money helped finance it. Hollywood stars promoted it. The Flamingo Hotel opened in 1946. It lost money at first. Then suddenly, it didn't. Vegas exploded. And Mayor Lansky became the banker of Las Vegas. But Hollywood remained essential, because Hollywood didn't just generate money. It shaped culture. It shaped perception. And Mayer understood something terrifyingly simple. If you control the stories people watch, you control what they believe. Which meant the Jewish mafia didn't just touch Hollywood, it quietly shaped it. And in part 2, we'll explore how Lansky's network embedded itself inside studios, talent agencies, and celebrity circles, and how some of Hollywood's biggest legends unknowingly worked inside a criminal ecosystem. By the late 1930s, Hollywood had become America's most powerful cultural machine. Movies didn't just entertain, they defined fashion, they influenced politics, they shaped morality. And behind that machine, Mayor Lansky's fingerprints were everywhere, but never visible, never provable, always deniable. That was his genius. Unlike gangsters who chased headlines, Lansky operated through intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, talent agents, business partners, men who looked legitimate, men who wore clean suits and spoke softly, men who never carried guns. These men became the bridge between organized crime and Hollywood. One of Lansky's primary strategies was infiltration through financing. Many independent film productions struggled to secure traditional loans. Banks considered movies risky. Studios often refused to back small projects. Lansky-backed money stepped in. No paperwork, no questions, high interest, producers desperate to get films made accepted. Once mob money entered a production, control followed. Casting choices could be influenced. Distribution routes adjusted. Accounting manipulated. Even if producers didn't realize who truly financed their film, someone did. And that someone reported back to Mayer. Another major gateway was talent agencies. Actors depended on agents for roles, contracts, and publicity. Several agencies quietly partnered with mob-connected investors. These connections gave Lansky's network influence over careers. An actor who cooperated received opportunities. An actor who refused found auditions drying up, not through threats, not through violence, through silence. Hollywood's most effective weapon, being ignored. Careers died quietly, which meant most people learned to play along. Hollywood parties became crucial intelligence hubs. Bugsy Siegel threw legendary gatherings. Stars, producers, politicians, musicians, socialites. Everyone drank, everyone talked. Loose lips revealed who was cheating on contracts, who was in debt, who was vulnerable. Information was power, and Mayor Lansky collected information obsessively. He rarely used blackmail aggressively. He preferred subtle pressure. A quiet reminder, a casual mention, enough to ensure cooperation. But Lansky's greatest influence wasn't in creating films. It was in shaping what films did not show. Hollywood almost never portrayed Jewish gangsters. Italian mobsters dominated crime cinema. Irish gangsters appeared occasionally. But Jewish organized crime, almost invisible, this wasn't an accident. Lansky understood optics. He didn't want attention. He didn't want copycats. He didn't want law enforcement curiosity. So stories about Jewish crime were quietly discouraged. Scripts were altered. Projects died in development. Characters changed ethnicity. Hollywood's crime narrative became selective, which helped maintain Lansky's myth of non-existence. At the same time, Las Vegas became Hollywood's playground. Stars headlined casino showrooms. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. They performed at mob-controlled venues. They socialized with mob bosses. Some knew. Some pretended not to. Sinatra, in particular, had long-standing connections to organized crime figures. Whether he knowingly worked with Lansky remains debated, but his career and mob-controlled casinos were deeply intertwined. Vegas and Hollywood became one ecosystem, and Mayer sat at the center. Law enforcement suspected. They always suspected. The FBI tracked Lansky for decades, but he left no paper trails, no recorded phone calls, no signed orders. He used couriers, face-to-face meetings, codes. When Bugsy Siegel began skimming money from the Flamingo, Mayer didn't threaten him publicly. Bugsy was murdered in 1947, shot through the eye while sitting in his girlfriend's living room. The message was clear. Even legends weren't untouchable, especially not by Mayer. After Bugsy's death, Lansky tightened control. Vegas profits stabilized. Hollywood laundering channels expanded. The machine ran smoothly. The post-war era became Lansky's golden age. He held stakes in casinos across Vegas, Cuba, and the Caribbean. Hollywood money fueled international expansion. Cuba, under dictator Fulgencio Batista, became another mob paradise. Luxury hotels, casinos, nightclubs. Hollywood celebrities vacationed there, photographed smiling beside men who were laundering their own box office profits. But success breeds attention, and attention breeds enemies. By the 1950s, Senate investigations into organized crime began. Televised hearings shocked America. Mafia bosses were exposed, but Mayor Lansky, never convicted, never imprisoned. He invoked the Fifth Amendment hundreds of times. He smiled, he waited, and he survived, but pressure mounted, which forced Lansky to attempt something desperate: escape. In Part 3, we'll explore Lansky's failed flight to Israel, the collapse of his empire's secrecy, and how Hollywood slowly began distancing itself from the mob, without ever fully cutting ties. By the early 1960s, Mayor Lansky faced something he had spent his entire life avoiding: heat. Not just police attention, not just newspaper rumors, but sustained federal pressure. The FBI, IRS, and Senate were closing in. Years of surveillance had produced mountains of circumstantial evidence. They still lacked a smoking gun, but they believed one existed, somewhere, hidden, just like Lansky himself. Mayer's wealth was legendary. Some estimated hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet officially, he claimed modest income, small business interests, consulting work. The math never added up, which made tax evasion the government's primary weapon. They couldn't prove murder, they couldn't prove racketeering, but they could prove unpaid taxes, just like they did with Al Capone. Mayer knew this, and he made a bold move. In 1970, Lansky fled to Israel. Under the law of return, Jews could claim citizenship. Mayer believed Israel would protect him. He believed his identity would shield him. He was wrong. The Israeli government, under heavy U.S. pressure, investigated his background. They concluded that Lansky posed a danger to public safety. His citizenship request was denied. He was deported back to the United States. It was a humiliating defeat. The myth of Mayor Lansky's invincibility cracked. Back in America, the government charged him with tax evasion. The trial became a spectacle. An old man in thick glasses, soft-spoken, polite, nothing like the monster described by prosecutors. His defense team painted him as a misunderstood businessman, a victim of rumors, a man persecuted for his associations. Astonishingly, the jury acquitted him. Once again, Mayer walked free. But his empire was no longer what it once was. Hollywood had changed. The studio system was collapsing. New corporate owners took over. Publicly traded companies replaced family-run studios. Compliance departments appeared. Accountants demanded documentation. Mob-style cash operations became harder, not impossible, but riskier. The golden age of easy laundering was ending. At the same time, public perception of organized crime shifted. Movies like The Godfather romanticized Italian mafiosos, but they also made audiences more curious about real-life mob figures. Journalists began digging deeper. Books were written, documentaries produced, and for the first time, Meyer Lansky's name entered mainstream awareness. Still, Hollywood largely avoided portraying Jewish organized crime. The silence persisted. Privately, Lansky's network continued operating. Not at the massive scale of before, but enough to maintain influence. Some casino interests, some real estate, some offshore holdings. Mayer himself lived quietly in Miami Beach, a small house, simple routines. Neighbors described him as polite, friendly, unassuming. It was the ultimate disguise, an old grandfather figure, not a criminal mastermind. But behind that gentle exterior lived a man responsible for shaping modern organized crime, and for embedding it inside America's most powerful storytelling industry. Meyer Lansky died in 1983. Official net worth at death, $300,000. Most historians consider this number laughable. They believe vast sums remained hidden, buried in offshore accounts, held by trusted associates, lost forever, or passed quietly to successors. But his real legacy wasn't money, it was structure. Lansky proved crime could operate like a multinational corporation. He proved violence wasn't necessary for dominance. Control of finances, control of information, control of culture. These were more powerful than guns. Hollywood had been one of his most effective tools, not because he made movies, but because he influenced the environment around them. What stories were told, what stories weren't, who succeeded, who disappeared, which reputations were protected, which were destroyed. In Part 4, we'll examine specific rumored Hollywood figures connected to Lansky's orbit, the blurred lines between celebrity and criminality, and how myth and reality continue to intertwine. Hollywood has always thrived on illusion, carefully curated images, manufactured legends, careers built on perception. And for decades, that illusion quietly served Meyer Lansky's interests. Because the brighter the spotlight shined on celebrities, the darker the shadows became behind them. Many actors and entertainers who worked in mob-connected casinos or socialized with known gangsters insisted they were unaware of criminal ties. In some cases that may be true, in others, willful ignorance. When performers signed contracts to headline in Las Vegas during the 1940s and 1950s, they didn't ask where the money came from. They didn't want to know. Because the checks cleared, and the crowds loved them, this created a gray zone, not criminals, not innocent, participants in a system that quietly normalized organized crime. Frank Sinatra remains the most famous example. He had friendships with mob figures. He performed at mob-run casinos. He helped certain associates get meetings. No court ever proved criminal wrongdoing, but his proximity was undeniable. Lansky understood the value of celebrity. Stars provided legitimacy. If famous people felt comfortable around mobsters, then mobsters appeared respectable, which helped maintain their operations. Producers and studio executives also walked that line. Some knowingly accepted mob money. Some convinced themselves it came from anonymous investors. Some simply didn't care. Movies were expensive, risky, if someone offered financing with no questions asked. It was tempting. This created a culture of plausible deniability. Nobody left paper trails. Nobody signed confessions. Everything happened through conversations, handshakes, middlemen. Exactly how Lansky preferred it. Rumors swirled for decades about specific studios being more mob-influenced than others. No definitive proof exists, but patterns emerge. Studios that mysteriously survived financial crises. Films that were obvious money losers yet repeatedly funded. Executives who maintained suspiciously lavish lifestyles. Historians believe these were classic laundering tactics. A movie didn't need to succeed. It only needed to justify moving large amounts of cash. One of the darkest aspects of Lansky's Hollywood influence involved unions. Control of projectionists, stagehands, and drivers meant control of production itself. If a studio crossed certain lines, suddenly no one showed up to work. If a producer cooperated, everything ran smoothly. Hollywood executives publicly railed against union corruption. Privately, many relied on it. Because corrupt unions were predictable. Predictability is valuable in business, even dirty business. Despite all this, Hollywood continued projecting an image of moral superiority. Crime existed on screen, but real corruption behind the camera remained hidden. This hypocrisy wasn't accidental. It protected profits. It protected reputations. It protected the system. Which is why stories about Lansky's Hollywood connections remain controversial. Some historians downplay them. Others argue they were central. The truth likely exists in the middle. Lansky didn't control Hollywood in the sense of issuing orders to studios. He didn't choose movie plots. He didn't cast actors. What he controlled were pressure points. Money, labor, access, and those were enough. By the time Mayor Lansky died, Hollywood had mostly severed overt mob ties, corporate ownership, stricter regulations, digital accounting. All made old-school laundering harder. But the culture Lansky helped build remained. A culture where power hides behind layers, money moves invisibly, and appearances rarely reflect reality. In Part 5, we'll explore what Lansky's story means today, how modern entertainment still wrestles with hidden power structures, and why his shadow still looms over Hollywood's golden image. Mayor Lansky is gone. Bugsy Siegel is gone. Lucky Luciano is gone. The men who built the foundations of organized crime are long dead, yet their blueprint survives, because Lansky didn't just build a criminal empire, he built a system. A system designed to outlive individuals. Modern organized crime looks different, less visible, less violent, more corporate, cybercrime, financial fraud, money laundering through shell companies and international banks. But the principles remain identical. Follow the money, control infrastructure, influence culture. Mayor Lansky pioneered that model decades earlier. Hollywood was simply one of its earliest proving grounds. Today's entertainment industry is dominated by massive corporations, streaming platforms, global franchises, billion-dollar intellectual property. At first glance, it appears completely sanitized. But power is still concentrated. Deals still happen behind closed doors. Careers still rise and fall quietly. Public narratives still mask private realities. The names have changed. The mechanisms have not. Lansky's story forces an uncomfortable question. How much of what we consume is shaped by forces we never see? Not necessarily mobsters anymore, but billionaires, political interests, corporate alliances. Influence doesn't disappear. It evolves. Hollywood loves to tell stories about criminals, but it rarely likes telling stories about itself, because self-examination threatens the brand. It threatens the myth. The myth that success is always earned. The myth that talent always wins. The myth that corruption exists somewhere else. Mayor Lansky proved otherwise. He proved corruption could wear a suit, smile politely, donate to charities, attend premieres, and never once pull a trigger. Perhaps that is why his story remains strangely absent from mainstream cinema. Italian mobsters get epics, Irish gangsters get biopics, cartels get multi-season series, but the Jewish mafia rarely explored. Because Lansky's true power wasn't cinematic, it was administrative. And administration is scarier than violence, because it's harder to see, harder to fight, harder to stop. Mayor Lansky once said, "I don't run things. I just make sure things run." That sentence perfectly captures his legacy. He didn't want thrones. He didn't want crowns. He wanted systems. And systems endure. Hollywood will always present itself as a dream factory, a place of imagination, hope, transformation. But every dream factory requires machinery, and sometimes that machinery is built by men history prefers to forget. Mayor Lansky was one of those men, invisible, calculating, relentless. The shadow behind the spotlight, and his shadow still lingers, still lingers.